Britain probably represents best practice. So the British government, coalition, has said we're basically going to nail this in our first term. It's credible, it's a program where they haven't blinked, and they're getting the benefit of that. There is no way that you can, in a half-hearted fashion, deal with the deficit. You've got to have two things at your disposal. First of all, you have to have comprehensive information. You really have to understand where the pressure points are. You have to have very full information, which you can only get if you've got modern accounting systems and modern budgeting systems. So the first thing is the landscape. Do you know what sort of peril you're in? If many countries had had that, they wouldn't have got into the perilous position in the first instance. And secondly, only comprehensive reform will do the trick. This is not a problem that permits of marginal correction. So the usual approach of, we'll do a quango hunt, we'll do some salami slicing, we'll put a lid on public sector hiring. All of that is a completely erroneous and a delusional approach. Politicians, first of all, have a tendency to kick the can down the road, and B, to be delusional. So kicking the can down the road requires you to rethink your approach. You've got to be very honest with the public about the double jeopardy of a public that's got hooked on entitlements and the country that's got hooked on debt, trying to fund those entitlements because they certainly have not been earned. So a country like New Zealand, 20 years ago, this wasn't just done yesterday, this was 20 years ago, we faced up to the necessity, A, to get better information, which is why we moved to accrual accounting. We didn't do it because we were in love with some accounting standard. We were in love with the idea that you really needed to know what was at stake, what were you managing, what did it cost, what was your exposure, what were your unfunded liabilities. Those issues were the ones that drove us to give ourselves better tools to do the job. And secondly, I think another very instructive lesson from New Zealand is when you bake in institutions like fiscal rules, standards of fiscal responsibility, you bake in transparency, you bake in the requirement for governments in a very full but frequent fashion to cough up the state of public finances, to talk about them in a strategic sense, to have open budgeting. When you change the rules of the road, you change political behaviour and you change outcomes. Why haven't governments been willing to embrace the kind of accounting standards they expect in the private sector? Perhaps they haven't cared to deal with the consequences of their actions, and the big consequences, the unfunded liability, particularly for pensions, particularly for employment benefits. It's a giant Ponzi scheme. They've promised big and funded little, and now the awful reality is exposed. I don't believe so, because when you're faced with an awful truth, that sense of reality, facing up to that sense of reality, really does temper your decision making. You can't engage in a delusion anymore. You can't engage in a Ponzi scheme anymore. You must face the cost of promises you make now into the future. That's just faulty economics. I mean, if fiscal stimulus worked, why don't you have high growth in America? If high public spending worked, why have you got Europe in such a funk? There's only one way to get growth, and that's because private individuals and firms decide that there's a niche in the market that they can best exploit. They put at risk their capital, they put at risk the human capital, and they chase after that market. The state does not create growth. The state can only spend the product of others' labours. And if the state decides to spend to such an extent and tax to such an extent, then you shouldn't be surprised if you tax high, the very thing you're taxing will diminish. So it is a nonsense to say that a deficit-busting route is a growth-denying route. On the contrary, better behaved governments have higher credit ratings, are more likely to attract the kind of growth, investment and risk-taking that is required to basically unleash the entrepreneurship, the innovation from the private sector. I mean, these days it's all about innovation. Innovation in public finances, innovation in the private sector. The state has to play its part. Quality of public policy matters a lot to growth. It can kill growth, but the growth impulse lies in the commitment and in the desire and in the appetite for risk and innovation of individuals.